Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our second semester this year of our curriculum series. Very happy to start this curriculum series with Arnon. Arnon is an associate professor of philosophy here from the Hebrew University, and he specializes in the philosophy of science with a particular interest in biology and neuroscience. Among other things, he's occupied with the question of what does it mean to understand in science and biology, a topic that I think is very relevant for many of us here at ELSC as an interdisciplinary center with research coming from different fields. Each one of us has different notion of what understanding means. And today Arnon will discuss optimality and what does it mean to claim that a system, or in our case we use the brain, is optimal or striving to be optimal. Optimality is an idea that most of us have used in our work, whether we are experimental biologists, cognitive scientists, or physicists, and I think it will be interesting to dive deeper to the meaning of optimality. And what does it mean when you say a system is optimal? So, Arnon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan, for the invitation. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is a philosophy talk, so there will be more words, less images and figures and numbers. And I want to, I won't be talking for very long. That's mainly because I kind of want to hear your views and thoughts. So about half an hour, maybe a little longer. So let me just start with explaining what I'll be talking about. There's many modeling efforts in biology, in neuroscience in particular, that take the form of what you might call an optimality analysis. Basically trying to show that some function or task or computation is performed optimally, so as best as possible in some sense. And so the question basically that I want to ask is, what is the rationale behind these kinds of analyses and what do they give us? And what in particular and how optimality might explain. The main claims that I want to be making are the following. First, that optimality can play a role in explanation only if there's an optimizing force or process, something that brought it about that the trait or task or function is optimal. Second, that evolution by natural selection is the only likely candidate for such an optimizing force or process. Thirdly, that there are reasons to doubt that natural selection brings about optimal outcomes, in many cases at least. And finally, that optimality can still serve a kind of non-explanatory methodological role, but if that's the rationale behind using it, then we should be quite careful about the conclusions we draw from the relevant analysis or modeling. Like I said, it's mostly going to be a philosophical sort of conceptual sort of thinking about this, but I want to start just with a couple of examples to give you a feel for what this thing that I'm calling optimality modeling or analysis is. They both involve Bayesian computation, which I'll say a word about. The first one comes from work by William Bill Bialik, and he builds on a kind of tradition of experimental work that looks at the limits of detection of the human visual system, and in particular, its ability to detect single photons. And what he tries to show is that the eye can be modeled as maximizing the probability of detecting single photons hitting rod cells in the retina by performing a kind of Bayesian computation that assumes a prior, both about the rate at which photons hit the retina, and by taking account, that's especially important, of noise that comes both from the stochastic nature of light emission and from the stochastic processes in rod cells, in particular in the rhodopsin molecule. As he states pretty forcefully, I think, at the end of sort of laying out this analysis, he says rod cells act as near perfect photon counters, at least across some range of conditions. Now, this is where the bottom image is. There's some experimental work that doesn't fully agree with the exact analysis that Bialik gives. Maybe you know it. Those of you who know it probably know it better than I do. But it's the basic message that I'm sort of trying to highlight here. right? The idea is that the eye is capable of responding to single photons, and in this respect, it's a, as Bialik puts it, near perfect. The second example is quite different. It's similar in one way, but it's different in other ways. It comes from a more higher cognitive kind of process. It comes from work by Tom Griffiths and Josh Tenenbaum. Both are more kind of cognitive, somewhat computational guys. And they tested, this is a paper from 2006, although they have a bunch of work in this kind of style. They tested whether people are good, how good people are estimating at the duration or extent of certain everyday magnitudes. Like lifespans of humans, the gross incomes of movies, the length of poems, things like that. They took a bunch of data sets. They gave people, they varied the amount of information that people got, and then they asked people to guess. You meet a person, they look this age, what's their likely lifespan? You've heard that this movie has grossed this much, what's the likely, what's it likely to gross overall? And they found a pretty good match between an ideal Bayesian predictor and what everyday people do. And so as they put it, the results of our experiment reveal that, that people's judgments were close to the optimal predictions produced by our Bayesian model across a wide range of circumstances. So obviously, the case is there are some differences between them. They deal with different kinds of functions. But one thing they have in common is this kind of similar message, and that's that people make optimal or nearly optimal use of information, in these cases by performing a Bayesian computation under noisy or in noisy conditions with noisy inputs. Like I say, these are examples to give you a kind of flavor for what I have in mind. Now, what is optimality modeling? Saying something about it more generally might help. You find this kind of analysis or this kind of modeling strategy in many parts of biology, and generally speaking, you might say that it's an attempt to show that some organism, usually some subsystem of an organism, some trait or task or function, is performed as best as possible. I've used examples where optimality involves Bayesian inference, and that I think is an important class of cases with in this category. But optimality in general or optimal performance of the brain doesn't have anything specifically to do with Bayesian computation. That's more of a kind of an example than something that most of what I'll say actually applies to optimality in a more general sense. But I'll use it because it's a helpful example. Two quick comments here is that optimality analyses or modeling efforts of these sorts usually make at least two sorts of assumptions. First of all, they have to make an assumption about what the system's task or function is, what it's trying to do, such that it's doing that as best as possible, optimally. And second, what resources are available to the system and what constraints it's under, how fast it works, what the energetic cost it is, what risks and opportunities are involved, and so on. These, at least in the background, at least implicitly, these assumptions are always made. So the main question is, or the main question I want to talk about is, what's the justification? What's the rationale behind these kinds of analysis? Why? What's the point of searching for optimality? And broadly speaking, I think we can distinguish two sorts of answers. One is an explanatory rationale. One is a methodological rationale. The other is an explanatory rationale. I'll talk about them in reverse order and devote most time to the second one, to explanation. Basically, to use optimality in a kind of explanatory way is to say that the system does what it does because that's the optimal way of doing things. I'll say a bit more about what that means in a minute, but the main point is that, in contrast, when you use it in a methodological way, that has to do with your means of generating a model, a hypothesis, and so on. So I want to, with that kind of, those two sorts of basic rationales or justification in mind, let's look at explanatory uses of explanation. My starting point, I guess, is that simply showing that our brain or some animal's brain or some subpart of it does things optimally in some specified sense, I mean, that might be satisfying and interesting, but it doesn't, as yet, explain anything. Right? To explain the performance by appealing to optimality means that, roughly speaking, the performance depends on its being optimal. Right? There's some relation of dependency, you might call it. Now, one kind of dependency is mechanistic. Right? A phenomenon can be explained by decomposing it into parts, showing what the relationships between those parts are, where they're situated relative to each other. So that's one kind of, you might say, explanatory dependence. The other is what, in philosophy, is usually called an etiology, or basically a process that brings something about. And here, evolution and individual development are important processes that I'll talk about. Just to make this kind of distinction clear, you can take a sort of analogy from a man-made device or system like a car. One kind of explanation, the first, the mechanistic kind, involves looking under the hood, basically, looking what the parts are, where they are, how they come together, when each act, and so on, and seeing how that delivers some performance in the car, some feature that you're interested in. The other kind, what I call the etiological kind, involves looking back at the process that is responsible for this car, the manufacturing, the design and manufacturing process in the case of a car, and seeing how it resulted in a car. Okay, so the main point I want to make here in making this distinction is, suppose we model a system using an optimality tool, like we show that it's performing an optimal Bayesian computation, an ideal Bayesian predictor, and so on. And suppose to simplify that is the case. We have a good match between our model and whatever experimental results. Still, that doesn't show that optimality explains the performance of the system. Right? That just shows that it is optimal in some sense. If you want to explain it, you want to show that it's because it's optimal that it does what it does. And I'll suggest that these are maybe the two main ways. Towards the end, I'll talk about something that maybe is a little bit different, and I'm not sure is exactly a kind of explanation, but these two main ways are the relevant kinds of explanation that we might use or rely on to understand that idea. Okay, so let's begin with a mechanistic option. And like I said, a mechanistic explanation is one that at some level of specificity picks the system apart, describes its parts, and how they interact. Here's a straightforward example, DNA replication. DNA replication, as you would find it in a textbook or whatever, involves an explanation of this process, involves describing DNA, describing how two strands are related to each other, describing various enzymes, helicase, DNA polymerase, all those sorts of enzymes, how those enzymes attach to DNA, how various other cofactors are involved, how these recruit nucleotides from the surrounding medium, and generating a new strand, and so on. I assume you're familiar with all of this, and the details don't matter that much. The basic idea is this is what a mechanistic sort of a kind of paradigm example of a mechanistic explanation looks like. Now, is DNA replication optimal? I don't know. Maybe people have studied this and they know the answer. But the point I would like to make is that explanation that I just described, and I kind of gave you the general outlines of, it doesn't depend on it. It's a separate matter, right? It might be a further fact about DNA replication, that it's optimal in some sense, maybe energetically, maybe in some other sense. But that's not part of the mechanistic explanation. The mechanistic explanation, you might say, stands or falls as in terms of whether it describes the right parts and how the parts are related to each other and how this system interacts and results in a new DNA molecule. a given mechanism may perform optimally, but that's a further kind of fact. So what might this further fact kind of be, this further explanation? That's where I think etiology comes in, a process. Get back to the example of the car. It's the car's design and production process that explain how efficiently it works, and in particular, whether some aspect of it is done optimally. How does this translate into systems, into explanations of systems of a biological sort rather than cars? I think we need to find a relevant etiology. The first, and I think the main option here, I'll argue basically the only option, is evolution, and in particular, evolution by natural selection. Natural selection can produce optimal outcomes. And in principle, this is how you might sort of use optimality to explain. Why does it explain the system? Because optimality is the process is brought about by natural selection, and that explains why the system does what it does. In particular, why it does it optimally. But more generally, sort of putting this more generally, natural selection, you might think of it as a process that sort of discards bad designs, selects for good designs, and in that sense, it sort of pushes systems towards better and better design. But this holds only if there are no constraints. That's only if the sort of natural selection is not constrained by some obstacle, right? And that's a pretty big if, which I think is worth sort of pausing on and saying a few words about. There's several sort of kind of claims here. First is natural selection in general doesn't operate on traits. It operates on organisms as a whole. Right? Traits are not selected one by one, but organisms are selected. They reproduce, they survive, they reproduce, and so on. And that's a pretty significant constraint, because a trait might look optimal from one standpoint, but if it's not energetically, or let's put it, if it's too costly in energetic terms, if it's hard to reliably develop it, if it places the organism in some danger from pathogens or predators or whatever, then although it might seem optimal from a standpoint that isolates the trait, it isn't going to be selected. It's not optimal in the sense relevant for natural selection. So for instance, being an ideal Bayesian observer may be the optimal way of handling noisy inputs, but if it's very costly to perform a Bayesian computation, then there's no special reason to suppose that it will be selected in a process of natural selection. Maybe this could be put the other way around. When we ask what it is that natural selection would favor, we need to ask this from this overall organism standpoint. And we can't just isolate a task theoretically or in the lab and assume that that's a good target for optimality analysis. A few, maybe three more points about this idea that natural selection actually faces quite significant obstacles. The first is that a certain trait is fitness maximizing, and would be optimal for the organism's fitness, means that if it arises, then it's likely to spread by natural selection. But it doesn't show that it will arise. So mutations are chance events, and the right mutation, especially if it involves a large and complicated structure, might not arise. If it doesn't arise, then the fact that it's hypothetically fitness maximizing doesn't really matter. A second point is that even if a beneficial mutation arises, it might lead an organism to what you might think of as a local optimum. Some trait configuration that is better than what it was before, but isn't necessarily the best possible, and where that local optimum, it's hard to get out of and reach the global maximum. A third point is that because of developmental and other constraints, selection can often only add features to existing structures, and this can result in what the psychologist Gary Marcus calls a kludge. Basically, a system that is a kind of patchwork, and works for the purpose that is at hand, but isn't what you'd expect if you designed a system to do this thing. Marcus, by the way, that's a book. It's a whole book on this. It's a very nice book. It's a fun book. I recommend it. I don't necessarily buy the thesis of the overall book, but it's a good reminder when thinking about evolution and cognition. It's devoted to the evolutionary questions about cognition, of the difficulties, and he gives a lot of interesting sort of small little examples and arguments. Now you might say, okay, so I've listed a bunch of constraints or conditions. When are these conditions met? Which systems or functions can be expected in general to be the products of selection? Maybe somewhat disappointingly, I don't think there's a very good general answer to this question. It needs to be a system where there's genetic variation, plentiful genetic variation. It needs to be a case where developmental pathways are flexible, that's for sure. Some people sometimes suggest that the sort of molecular level, especially protein level, is one kind of system like that, and you should expect optimality at the protein level. I'm not sure if that's right. If it's right, then something like the Bialik example that I gave early on would be a convincing case. But there are a lot of ifs. It's not obvious, and I think you would have to look at the cases in relative detail to say something convincing. Okay, I'll mention, as I said, I talked about etiologies, and I want to mention another option. It's sometimes mentioned, but honestly, I don't fully understand what the option being described here exactly is. If you have ideas, I'm happy to hear those. Development, well, in principle, since our brain develops, that is, development is the kind of etiology that brings about the brain, then you might think of development as a force that optimizes, brings about an organ or some features of which are optimal. But although that kind of seems to make sense initially, I'm not sure why that would be the case. In the case of evolution by natural selection, we have a very good reason for thinking that selection basically is a process that pushes systems to become better by discarding those that are not good through competition between individuals. But selection, although it is a kind of process that has you might think of as an end-directed process, but it's not obvious why that end should be seen as good or optimal in any clear sense. So it's often sort of said or written very quickly that evolution or development is responsible for optimality in various systems, but I'm not sure whether the or development adds much to evolution. It's kind of similar, but not in the right way. Okay, so here are some conclusions so far. What I've said or claimed so far is that, first of all, if optimality plays an explanatory role, then we need to assume some optimizing process or etiology that's responsible for optimality in the system that we're talking about. Mechanisms aren't processes in the relevant sense, right? They're a separate issue, as it were. Second, that development is a kind of process in the relevant sense, but it's not one that is especially optimizing. There's no special reason to think of it as an optimizing process. And finally, that evolution by natural selection is in principle a kind of optimizing process, but in practice, it may face pretty significant obstacles. So it's not an obvious sort of foregone conclusion that it leads to optimal outcomes. Earlier on, I said, look, you might think of explanation as mechanistic or as this kind of process-based explanation. I do think those are the two main kind of relevant senses of explanation here. But sometimes you hear something somewhat different, and that's that, and I'm not sure if this is a kind of explanation. I'm happy to hear if you have any thoughts about this. Sometimes people think, no, well, look, what optimality, what showing that a system is optimal does for us is it sort of makes sense of it. Right? It shows us what the point of the system is, what the sort of rationale of the system kind of is. Some people associate this with what Marr calls the computational level. Especially my colleague Arnon has some work on it where he associates this with Marr's so-called computational level and this idea that Marr has of a why question. I'm not necessarily tying it to that, but I do think we often want to understand why an organism or some subsystem of the organism, understand it sort of in this way, make sense of it, understand what's the point of what it's doing. Why should the human eye compute the Bayesian maximum likelihood of the form that Bialik describes, assuming that it does? Well, because that's a good way of detecting incoming light, light arriving at the retina, and it's useful for an organism that relies on its visual, on its vision to have sensitive or high sensitivity to light in its environment. I guess there's something to this. We do often gain insight in our everyday lives by, or in biology, by looking at an organism and seeing what's the point of what it does, given its environment, given its life history, given its various features. But I think that it's a big leap from this to optimality. Just as we can in our everyday lives make sense of other people by seeing what the rationale behind their actions is, without assuming that their rationale is very good, or that they've sort of thought about it in very sophisticated ways. So in the same way, we can sort of see what the point of what the eye does or any other part of the organism is without assuming that it's optimal. So I think this idea of making sense of a system, and maybe that's the idea that Marr had when he just talked about why questions, that's an okay idea. I see the sort of what's the point there, but I think it's a different idea from optimality. It doesn't require optimality. It's sort of somewhat separate questions. Okay, so basically that's all been about explanatory uses or the explanatory value of optimality. I've been pretty critical of it, as you maybe probably noticed. I want to talk about something that I mentioned in the beginning, and that's the methodological rationale for appealing or using optimality. What I mean by a methodological use is basically a way of constructing a model or formulating a hypothesis. So you define a problem, and then you construct a model that performs optimally on that problem. In a Bayesian context, to just give an example, that means basically minimally formulating what cognitive scientists usually call a generative model of the phenomenon. Basically, the probability the brain will see a given input X, provided that the state of the world is Y, and then thinking in terms of the reverse sort of discrimination problem, telling what Y is given the input X. And then this could be done in a fairly abstract way, or you can go on and specify exactly how this kind of problem is computed. Say in the Bayesian case, how you compute P of X given Y, or something like that. What matters is that here the only sort of role we're giving optimality is in solving the problem, sort of the computational problem, right? And the rationale, I think, a minimal rationale behind this is pretty straightforward and significant. It's basically that we know how to do this in many cases. Right? In many cases, we know how to solve for the maximum value of some function. Right? And that's a very important. That's a lot of what you study in math. When you study math, definitely for scientists, is all sorts of optimality problems that basically you solve for the maximum or minimum value of some function. So I think that's an important reason, and I don't want to downplay it. If you have an equation or a model, it's not very useful unless you can solve it, usually. But it should be clear that this kind of rationale doesn't show that optimality has any kind of explanatory value, that it tells us what the system that we're modeling does. It's part of constructing the model. It doesn't give us in and of itself any reason to suppose that the model is applicable. Right? It's optimality at the level of generating the model, solving equations, solving the model, and so I think they shouldn't be confused with a kind of different thing that might also be called a methodological rationale for using optimality, and that's the idea that we can use this as a first guess. Okay, so you might say, well, we have to start somewhere. We've solved this model by means of optimality, an optimality kind of solution. So let's start from there. I mean, it's fine. You can start from there, I think. But that's, I mean, it's only a guess, right? If it's a good first guess, it's still only a guess. Unless you have some other additional reasons, other justification of the sort that I described before, from evolution and so on, then the sort of, let's guess that the system is doing this and that optimally, is just that, a guess. So even though you might think of this as a kind of methodology, let's try this first, that's fine if you want to call it that, but it's important to see that it's still, if it's a good guess, that still depends on having some kind of justification of the sort I described before. Okay, so now I just want to kind of conclude, and I'm happy to hear what you think. What does optimality explain and how? My basic message is that there aren't very straightforward answers to this question, very good straightforward answers to this question. A mechanistic explanation, when you have one, just seems to me like a separate question, separate matter. It doesn't make contact with optimality. It's an explanation in its own terms. A true optimality explanation requires some assumption about a background process or a historical process that brought it about that the system is optimal. That process might be development, although I'm not quite sure how that would work. I mentioned that because I've heard it being said, but I'm not sure that works. Or it might be natural selection, but we can't take for granted that natural selection brings about optimal results even when it's present. I talked about this idea of making sense of the organism, seeing why or what the point of what it does. I think that's a real thing in a sense, but it's not a form of explanation, I think, in the relevant way. And in any event, it doesn't really connect to optimality. You can make sense of something without seeing it as optimal. I don't want to sound as if I'm saying that this notion of optimality is useless, because like I said towards the end, it's often a very valuable tool in constructing a model. There's a kind of tractability justification for it, but that's a matter of generating a model. And so as such, it's not part of explaining the task that we're modeling in and of itself. Thank you. Should I take a question?
You made a strong argument against using, blaming everything on evolution, saying that natural selection is the etiological process that brought about optimality of a system, saying that it aims to optimize an organism or the entire organism and not a specific subsystem.
Right.
And it's a short point because if it's true, it kind of renders this whole idea of taking a system, analyzing it, building a model as an explanation kind of useless because our division into subsystems seems almost arbitrary. But I want to offer a counterpoint, which is optimizing process itself grows more complex as the system grows, meaning to optimize something optimally, it might be better to optimize over subsystems, even though it's maybe suboptimal in regard to the organism, and maybe then some kind of an over-process optimizes the balances between the subsystems. It's not rigorous enough without doing any calculation, but I'm saying as a counterpoint, even if your aim is to generally have an optimal system, if the system is complex enough, and the search space grows exponentially with the number of parameters, then it might be better to optimize over subsystems, and the division into subsystems could come from systems that are shared across organisms, maybe like the vision, which is something, and then it makes more sense to optimize there and just kind of solve the, maybe if one system is very, very costly, makes other systems very costly, solve over this, and that could be an argument for focusing on subsystems.
Yeah. Well, I have three quick things to say about that. It's an interesting thought. The first thing is, you start out mentioning mechanistic versus this kind of etiological explanation. I think part of the problem maybe sometimes is that in mechanistic explanations, it's much less clear that you shouldn't look at them one by one. It's at least a lot more, seems a much better strategy. And maybe part of the problem is we forget about that when we switch to this other, right, that, we look at, we break it apart mechanistically, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything when we think in terms of optimality. The other point is, what you described seems like a deliberate optimizing process and how it would work, and the basic strategy was, let's break it down, optimize each one of them. That would be fine, but I don't know if you can think in those terms about evolution. Evolution can break, our visual system down, optimize it, and then sort of plug it back in. It's not going to work. And just, that's the last comment here, which is why I kind of like that Gary Marcus book. Many of the problems he describes are exactly of this nature. He says, look, there are many systems and many sort of bugs and weird features of our cognitive, mainly concerned with cognitive phenomena, he thinks are due to the fact that it's actually quite hard to put together systems, right? And there are many problems of interface. They think evolution sort of solved in a pretty haphazard, not very effective way. Now, like I said, I don't know if it's an interesting argument. I don't know if it's correct, but it's an interesting sort of idea. So
from a general question, you can say something about the role of a priori assumptions and optimality. Because basically,
what do you mean by a priori assumptions?
If you want to have the knowledge of optimality, you need to be able to assess it before.
You're right that it's very hard to assess it. I guess in a sense what I was trying to talk about in a way, I didn't think about it this way, is about whether you should have the a priori assumption that the system is optimal or not. And thinking sort of relatively not sort of devoting a lot of thought to natural selection, you might think, well, why shouldn't it be optimal? After all, it's the point of selection, and selection is an optimizing force. And I tried to say, look, that a priori assumption shouldn't really be made so quickly. What's the alternative, you might ask? There's a real problem here, I think. I would say that the alternative is a much more mechanistic sort of overall strategy, because I agree, optimality, and that's what I mentioned towards the end, is a very powerful tool if you want to build a model. You often need that. So if you want to build a model and it's not constrained by the mechanistic details, it's going to be hard to do that without any pretty strong optimality assumptions. So that sort of pushes you in a mechanistic direction, I think. Yeah.
So towards the end, you talked about considering optimality to give just a first good guess, but I think it's anything more than just a guess. So maybe natural selection, while not being good enough to provide us with provide optimality actual explanatory role, it is good enough for that, to justify starting out from
Maybe, I'm always suspicious of this sort of, let's start out this way, because I want to know what the next move is, right? If you start out, okay, fine. Now what's your next step? How ready are you to acknowledge that the first step was a misstep, right? So often it seems to me that people say, well, this is a good first guess, but actually they don't then go question it. They don't really treat it as just a guess. They kind of treat it as a good hypothesis. Sometimes that's fine, but here I was not. So I'm a little bit, if you're willing to just really treat it as a guess, that would be a big step towards what I was trying to argue.
So I wasn't clear why you make a distinction between a model and an explanation. Let's say I write down a model.
Right.
So I'm assuming optimality just by finding what are the constraints I need to add to the model in order for it to describe the reality. I learn a lot about the system I can explain. So why is it not?
I was taking it that explanation basically is a kind of showing what the features you're interested in the system, in the brain system, is what they depend on, not what sort of, maybe that, one of the things I said towards the end is making sense of the behavior. Maybe that's a little bit closer to just working.
So you can put constraints that are not behavior. All different kinds of constraints,
Right.
but you can always, if you want to explain something or learn something, you can choose what are you optimizing, what.
Right,
what
yeah,
are
I agree. So
what type of constraint to use.
right at the beginning I said, look, you have to make, always have to make assumptions about the system's resources and constraints. And I could have given the entire sort of argument here by sort of stressing this, that really you need to place a lot of constraints if you want to make a convincing case for optimality. The outcome would be that from one point of view, it wouldn't seem very optimal any longer, right? It's like, you know, this is what Marcus talks a lot about. If you have a system that's already very, very complicated, you want to improve it in some way, you're usually going to end up with something pretty complicated that is not super good at what you want it to do. It's just somewhat better.
No, I'm using optimality as a tool, not as trying to
Right.
explain optimality, but it brings up an explanation, not just a model. By using it as a tool, I can.
No, I
get
agree.
explanation.
Well, so I put it this, okay, so maybe I misunderstood it. I guess, what makes it a true or a plausible explanation of the thing in the world? Not something that, you know, we can develop, we know how to solve, we know how to analyze. We can simulate it on a computer. What makes it also an account of what the actual system does? And I was saying, you can't
Once
just,
you write down an optimizer, that's math. We assume that math is.
sure,
is
yeah,
true.
yeah, no, of course it's valid within the model. I wasn't denying that, right? I mean, if it's like, you
So I guess my
actually
question is, why isn't the model has an
It's a
explanatory
potential
power,
explanation.
and not just modeling, not just predictive. Model can be explanatory.
No, I wasn't saying that it's predictive. I was saying it has potential explanatory kind of power, but you've arrived at your model by assuming that the system optimizes something. That's how you bought the model. It allowed you to make predictions. But it's not clear that, you know, that assumption, what justifies that assumption.
There's a system that has a lot of parameters. They can be anything in the world, but they are something specific.
Right.
Something drove them to that point, and they stopped driving them to that point.
So what's
So
that?
just by the fact that things keep respecting each other, it means that there are some forces forcing you those free parameters that you're trying to learn from the system to be a certain value. So you should be able to define, at least locally,
But why
a
think
function
that,
that's a minimum of.
why think that what's driving it, why think that the direction in which it's driving it is the direction of optimality, especially given that,
No, you're telling me what optimality is. I didn't say I didn't define here yet what is a loss and what is a cost. I'm just saying it has to be an extremum of some process. And optimization is just finding.
no, this is, yeah, okay. I was kind of hoping to not get, that's a, so whenever you have like a kind of optimality argument, if you want to call it, it has like, you know, the variables, the constraints, and the optimum that you reach given those variables and constraints. It's always very hard to say what you're solving for, in a sense, right? And often, definitely in the higher level sort of cognitive tasks, you can see a lot of play. Right? So it's actually very hard if you go back. So that's one reason why I'm somewhat more skeptical of these examples and somewhat more comfortable with these kinds of examples, is that actually it's very, very hard to see what exactly people are reasoning about such that they're doing it optimally. And so you can turn all this around and say, well, look, it is optimally, but you've just defined the task incorrectly. And it's not so easy to define the task, right? And so, but that would be essentially the same kind of argument if you wanted to make it about natural selection. You have to convince us that natural selection acts on this task in a natural environment that makes sense for the organism. If you already done all that in a convincing way, and then you show that what the optimum is, and so it matches, then that's fine. But that's almost never, I think, the case. Definitely not.
So maybe I think about optimality as a mathematical, just fine.
Right. Okay. Yeah, which I think is that's fine. That's fine.
And the word optimality as being best is just, we put optimal as best. I'm not saying optimal is best. I'm just saying it's somewhere that the system stopped.
If you can stick with that thinking, then I'm, you know, so like, you know, Bialik not only says this, he also thinks that this is a pretty basic principle of neuroscience. Right? That, you know, systems are optimal, and at least in some contexts, optimality is a truth about the brain, not a tool.
Okay, and a different one. You said you don't understand why development would be
Yeah.
an optimization process. So
Right.
what if evolution created and optimized, not optimized system?
Yeah, so there is that, but that's very rarely actually what people have in mind, I think. In some cases, you might think, well,
Learning.
what?
Learning.
But not learning in general, because in many learning processes, there's no reason to think that they're optimizing in any sense, right? It's not, I mean, we have to talk about specific cases, but in many cases, it's not obvious that there's any, you know, you learn, and why not think that you learn until it's good enough? You've learned enough to make it around in the world. It's not obvious that learning has to bring you to some optimum.
Again, it's about optimum of what?
Right.
Optimum for me is when you stop learning, that's optimum. When the system...
Well, but you would accept that in many cases, you know, there's more to learn, right? Just for your own sake, right? So the question is why...
The point is using the word optimal as best, and I'm saying optimal
Okay.
is best. Optimal is best.
All right, well, this is my evidence that some people at least think that, you know.
Just a small point referring to this is maybe there's just confusion between being optimal and optimizing. I mean, everything that Jonathan just said is referring to an optimization process. You can say learning a language in development is an optimization process, or also maybe the Omicron variant of the coronavirus is optimized, but nobody says that this is the optimal coronavirus, right? So if you make this distinction between optimization in the sense of reaching the optimum, then all your critique applies and make a lot of sense to me. But it doesn't mean that optimization processes per se are subject to the same criticisms. You can easily describe, I think, development or evolution of viruses as optimization processes without talking about the optimum.
I mean, Bialik is like, you know, and others, I'd like to give other examples. I don't think that's what they have in mind. I mean,
Oh,
it's a big deal for
and
him.
second example, yes, they are talking about being
Yeah.
optimal, and I understand why you criticize that. But that doesn't mean that speaking about evolution in terms of optimization is also wrong.
No, I wasn't objecting to that. I was objecting to the fact that it actually takes that course. Not that it is in principle an optimizing force. And if you want to just do math, you can also show that Bayesian updating is optimal from under some assumptions. But of course, that analysis only explains something if those assumptions hold. Right? So.
No, but this point of saying that.
But
the
these kinds of
optimal-
cases, I mean, one thing that's very kind of nice about them and kind of clear about them. So in this case, I mean, that's the whole sort of message. There's a physical limit to how good you could be at detecting light, and that physical limit depends on, you know, the stochastic process that goes on inside rod cells and on the physics of light. And Bialik, for instance, is very, very explicit that that's what he thinks. That we sort of, our eye has reached the physical limit, the possibility, the best possible sort of way of detecting light given physics. So that's, I mean, I agree, that's a strong claim and it's a sort of extreme, but it's not that rare, I think, to find those kinds of statements.
You said before that what you think we should do is to use a more general mechanistic explanation, right? But you mentioned that
Yeah.
for a few questions before. But the question is, optimizing or like a function is done optimally it's a characteristic of a function. What would be the function of a more general view of the brain or of the person that is optimized? Like, how would you look at the whole brain in an optimal sense?
Maybe that's, you know, a question that needs to await a lot of mechanistic information to really, you know. I'm not sure we know how to answer that question, except in pretty general kind of terms that don't give you a way of formulating models. If you want to say the goal of the brain is to help us sort of navigate the world, and the world, those are true, but they're really pretty kind of vague claims, and you can't build a model from that kind of insight. So, right. So, I mean, I guess, yes, part of what I'm saying here is a somewhat more bottom-up, is an argument for a somewhat more bottom-up approach, to the extent that, optimality is a kind of top-down. Look at the system, what is it trying to do, how would that be done optimally? That's a pretty top-down kind of approach.
In terms of evolution, you don't care about all the things. You only care about survival.
Reproduction
So
is a big deal.
well, you could call it
Big
reproduction,
survival.
survival of the organisms, not the individual. Yes. So my brain is not worrying about my survival, but it's built to take care of the species survival.
Right.
And that's the only goal of the brain, and therefore the only question that we have about optimality related to our brain is this. All the rest is byproduct of the fact that this is what it has to do. So all the rest is a simple question. You're not going to ask you, it's very simple. We just want to know how we navigate. Okay, so we ask the question optimality for navigation of a given brain that was evolved to this point, and at this point it can survive. It would not survive 2 million years ago, right? Our brain. Well, it would not be optimal for its purpose, but 2 million years ago.
But I think you're not going to, this way you're not going to avoid the kind of trade-offs that I discussed at one point, right? So, right, you want to survive, and to survive you need to navigate an environment. But of course, there's a limit to the amount of resources you're going to put into navigation, because if you only navigate all day, you're never going to get to eat or reproduce. So, so now you have to get into a lot of detail to see what navigation, under what constraints, how much, resources it's reasonable to devote to that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
and so
models deal with this. For example, navigation is a good example. Some species need the navigation more than we do, and therefore they have a better sense of navigation, right? They can sense the I don't know what the polar magnetic signals. We don't need it. So we are not less optimal than they.
I agree that though at that level of generality, it makes sense. But I think that you would need a lot more detail in order to construct specific models. And many of these trade-offs and constraints, they're going to come back. And we need to sort of worry about them when you get into the details.
You're right, the models become more and more complicated. And if you want to solve the problem of optimality, you would need to solve a very small problem first. Like Jonathan mentioned, right? You have a very specific question: how does my finger move? Does it move optimally or not? And that's what you answer. That's it. And you don't know about the rest of the constraints.
Yeah, and I guess I'm coming back to the point made earlier. That, then figuring out what is the optimal given various systems is also a very hard task. It's not obvious how we put together the systems so that optimizing one element doesn't lead to cause certain problems in other parts.
That's why science is hard.
The
I wasn't suggesting otherwise.
The representative of simplifying things is not here. He would tell you the only optimal question is how much dopamine you produce for each good thing that you do, and that's it. The rest is not important. No, I'm not saying that this is
No,
true.
definitely.
Okay, thank you very much.